Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. It's Monday, April 17th, and I'm your host, Cara Santa Maria. Now, this week, we are talking to an incredible author, Daniel Suarez, about his new book, Change Agent. But before we jump into that, I want to thank those of you who have made Talk Nerdy possible this week. Now, remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download, and that is because of support from listeners like yourself. Those of you who want to patronize the show, or am I the patron? I think I'm the patron. Yeah, so you patronize. That's how it works. There are a few different ways you can do it. You can go to carasantamaria.com. You can buy something from the online store. You can click through the PayPal portal. But it does seem to be that the most popular way to support the show is to visit my Patreon page. And that's at www.patreon.com/talknerdy. So I want to point to some of the big-time patrons of the show this week, and they include Phil T-Bear, Timothy Glover, Jonathan Wright, Pedro M. Rosario Barbosa, Christian Jeffrey, David Lacer, Jeffrey Perez, Stuart Ogue, The Honorable Husband, Charles Payette, Jafe, Gabriel, Felipe Jaramillo Gonzalez, Brian Holden, and Jeffrey Sewell. I thank you all from the bottom of my heart. All right, guys, without any further ado, I want to jump into this great conversation. He is a New York Times bestselling author of many books: Demon, Freedom, Kill Decision, Influx, and his newest book is called Change Agent. Daniel Suarez is a novelist who really focuses on sci-fi thrillers, high-tech, evidence-based science storytelling. And so he's done a lot of great due diligence for this specific book, and he focuses a lot on themes of, genetic modification, CRISPR, and what it will be to be human in the future. So without any further ado, here he is, the author of Change Agent, Daniel Suarez. Well, Dan, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
I'm really excited because I think that, well, first of all, we're doing this in person. Every time I do an in-person interview, I'm excited. I have to do so many remotely.
Yeah.
And I just feel like there's something that happens when you're...
same here.
Yeah.
When you can see the other person and there's not a half-second delay.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And because you are, touring for your book, you probably have to do so many phoners. It's hard.
Yes. Actually, coming up soon is a radio tour where for, the whole thing where for hours you just sit here and it's, drive time in Cincinnati. Now it's drive time in Detroit. Now you just keep going across the country. It's always interesting.
And it's all sound bites.
Yes,
it's all sound bites because you can't really take the time.
No.
That's what I love about podcasting.
And you
explore.
seem a little, very repetitive because you say the same thing 12 times in an hour and you're thinking, am I just incredibly boring? Yeah. And of course, the people are hearing it for the first time wherever you're saying it. But I think that's what comedians really do well is just tell the same joke.
It's true.
Again and again in front of a different audience with the same amount of verve.
Mm-hmm. And
it's tricky.
It's true, and act like it's the first time you've ever said it. Oh man, that's tough. But in person, it's so wonderful. And there's also another thing that I'm excited about today, and that is that I think you may be my first ever sci-fi author on the show.
Well, thanks for that.
Yeah. So the show really started as a science podcast, and then it sort of morphed into, let's just talk about things that I think are interesting. So it's a lot of science with a little atheism, a little feminism, a little, I'd say, civil rights, civil justice is thrown in. But once in a blue moon, science and sci-fi really merge.
Yeah.
And, there's some
There's
sci-fi.
There's a Venn diagram where
exactly.
they intersect, yeah.
There's some sci-fi where I'm like, I wouldn't call that sci-fi. Like, people call Star Wars sci-fi, for example. And I'm like, there's no science in Star Wars. That is pure fantasy.
Let's call it aspirational
Exactly.
science.
Whereas Star Trek is good sci-fi. A lot of really cool tech has come out of the brilliant minds of the people who...
we all have communicators now.
Exactly. Basically,
Actually, they're a little better than the communicators. Well, not in Los Angeles, seemingly.
I know.
I could see downtown Los Angeles, and I'll have 2 bars.
It's terrible. And even worse here is terrestrial radio. Like, you can't... When you try to listen to the actual radio in your car, come on.
I was trying to think the last time I tried to do that.
Yeah, I know, right?
I had a friend, he was a caver, he used to travel all around the world, and he called me from about 100 meters inside a cave in China. And he's like, I've got 4 bars.
Isn't that crazy?
And I guess they do it in order to keep rural populations happy. I'm thinking, okay, so Why not us? Why
I
are
know.
we not worth 4 bars
In my own house.
Yes,
exactly.
much less a cave.
I know, right? It's true. And there are places throughout the world where they have service in the subway, really good service.
Germany.
It's like you're underground.
Germany.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
They also have a clean subway cars.
They do.
I know. We don't have that here either. We hardly have a subway in LA. I mean, we do have one, and it is getting better. I don't want to denigrate, but it's tough in a big city like
$1
this.
billion a mile, but yeah.
Exactly. But, you know, you live in D.C., you live in New York, it makes more sense because it's so compact and it's a small land area. But, yeah, I hate to admit it. I never use public transit in Los Angeles. I do drive an electric car, so I don't feel too guilty.
Good.
But it'd be nice to be able to use more public transit. But, you know, it is what it is. And you're an LA local.
Yes, I am.
I
Pasadena.
love that.
Pasadena.
You're past. I was literally just in Pasadena for brunch.
Oh, we love Pasadena.
It's the best.
We do.
I was eating at Russell's in Old Town.
Yeah, right in Old Town. Was it Fair Oaks?
Yep.
Yeah. There's a ton of places I love there. And what passes for history in California is like 120, 130 years old, maybe.
It's true.
There's the missions, of course. But, you know, when you visit with German, European friends, they just kind of chuckle.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
Wow, that's cute.
It's cute, exactly. We're like, oh, look at our historic building from the 1940s.
That's right. You can watch the video that they produced at that time.
Exactly, that's true.
The video, it's not that old.
There's no paintings of anybody in the
That's right.
buildings. They're all, really modern photographs. So yeah, I'm really excited to be able to talk to you about your new book, which, when does it hit the shelves? Today?
April 18th.
April 18th. Okay,
so it's
we're
about a
recording
week or so
this.
away.
Yeah, we're recording this on the 11th, but it will actually air on Monday, which is, I'm looking it up because
what
I
is
can't
that
do
even?
math.
Neither can I.
It's like
I have
loading,
machines for doing
loading. Exactly. It's like, that's why I have a calendar. Monday will be the 17th.
17th.
So it will,
perfect
so
timing.
as of the time you're listening to
thank
this, you
then.
guys, yes.
I'll say thank you again.
This book will be coming out tomorrow, meaning you can order it right now.
So it's Change Agent, and it comes out April 18th, just a day after this podcast.
I love it. So change agent is something very specific. The title is hearkening to something very specific.
Yes.
What is a change agent?
Well, a change agent, and of course the double entendre, at least a double entendre. What this book is about is genetic change. And in this case, it's about an Interpol agent who is injected with a change agent that revises his genomic sequence and makes him into a person he was hunting. And of course, this really harkens back to an identity switch, which is one of the oldest archetypes, I think, in story. And that idea of switching identity, I wanted to update it by rooting it in realistic science and what's
Sure.
coming with CRISPR and genetic editing. And part of what I've been doing in social media in the lead up to the book is pointing to certain experiments, either with squirrel monkeys and eyes, having them injected with an adenovirus that's been programmed to give them the ability to see color. So you're genetically editing a mature organism, and that's now.
That's
in
crazy.
2003. So this book takes place about 30 years into the future. And what I really wanted to explore is this idea, if you look back 30 years, how absolutely radically the world has changed in just those 30 years. Because I remember, I'm old enough to remember, we didn't have cell phones. We didn't have the internet.
Yeah.
We didn't really we had ATMs, but they were not as, basically, you had to get physical things delivered to you.
Absolutely. Not long before that, if you look back another 30 years to like maybe our parents' generation, they didn't even have credit cards.
Yeah.
Everything was on paper.
right.
Or if they did have credit cards, you remember the old...
I do.
Yeah, the...
I do. I also remember being a child and learning that it was difficult, at least for the previous generation, for women to get their own checking account. And so that's how rapidly...
insane.
I mean, it's insane.
Yeah.
But we're sci-fi people to our younger selves in many ways, even if you just go back 20, 30 years. So what I was trying to conjecture was, in light of synthetic biology and genetic editing and what we're doing now, how radically could that change society? And I'm really looking at that as the foundation possibly of a fourth industrial revolution, a really, really dramatic change to society and what that would mean. And that's really what I'm getting at in this story in calling it change agent, is because, again, not just the personal transformation that the character is going through, but the radical transformation society as a whole would be going through.
Do you think And I think I actually do. I think I'm on Team CRISPR. But do you think that CRISPR is probably one of the most influential new technologies that's hit kind of the scientific community?
Absolutely. Without hesitation, I'd say coupled with synthetic biology.
Sure.
And again, this idea that you would take single-celled organisms, algae, yeast, bacteria, and reprogram them to do useful work, useful to human beings, to try to mitigate some of the harm, perhaps, that we've already done to the environment. And CRISPR would be useful in this regard as well, both for de-extincting species, possibly by making a tweak here or there to make them less vulnerable to whatever disease or situation befell them, again, possibly due to our own interference. So the idea of mastery of DNA serving as a foundation for the next future leap for humankind, I think, is pivotal. I think it will be the transistor of the 21st century, if not bigger.
And it could potentially dramatically extend human life simply because targeted therapies, right? Just genomic medicine, the ability to figure out what's going on with somebody and treat their specific version of whatever disease they're facing. And it is happening now, right? Like certain cancers might have markers on them, like hormone markers
CRISPR
that we
has
can
been
target.
earmarked as possibly the most promising approach for cancers because of that ability to laser target. I don't want to use the word laser because there's no lasers involved. But you know what I mean, a very pinpointed. And sure, right now they're still trying to fine-tune it and really understand how that CRISPR mechanism works. But I think it was just last month that Chinese engineers were able to correct a genetic disorder in an embryo, in a viable human embryo.
The first real human kind of trial that, was deemed successful.
Yes.
It's amazing.
Now, the other thing is people, I think, the members of the public at large, let's say, I think they're uneasy when they hear, GMOs and genetic modification and genetic editing. I think it makes some people uneasy. And I think a lot of that stems from, past large corporations and agribusiness making genetically modified organisms. And I always look at that, it's really the impetus, the reason for doing it. And a lot of what I think was being done with genetically modified crops was an intellectual property virus, in a way.
Yeah, I think that's really what people were upset about.
Well, the idea of owning life.
It was an
and being
ethical,
in control of it.
Yeah.
And that was, because to me, genetically modifying an organism in and of itself isn't necessarily bad. And I'll give you an example.
I think it's good. It's often good.
That's the thing.
Yeah.
I think it's like the internet. I think it's going to offer radically new abilities to change our environment, change our world, both for the good and the bad, and it's how we use it. The other thing is, like the internet, there's no putting the genie back in the bottle.
It's true.
We have this technological capability now, and it's on us to be able to handle it, to do something useful with it.
Absolutely.
And I think the opportunities are tremendous. And I'll give you one example. I was at a dinner up in Silicon Valley, and I sat next to a geneticist, and she was doing work with rice, strains of rice. And what she did was she modified a strain of rice by taking a gene from an Indian strain of rice, which was not popular, didn't have a high yield, but was able to survive under salt water for long periods of time. And she took one of the more popular strains of rice that is widely used throughout Asia and Southeast Asia and made a new strain of rice that could survive 17 days under salt water in order to help farmers deal with increased typhoons, rising waters. And of course, they made this available to everyone. It wasn't that they were capturing the market and forcing people to buy it.
Sure, because she was an academic scientist.
Yes. Yeah, University of California at Davis. And of course, I'm deliberately not using the name because I don't want to do so out of turn. But anybody could figure it out if you're a Google detective. But the point is that this was, to me, an unalloyed good. And so who am I to look at somebody, let's say farmers, who are desperate for a way to feed their families? This is not being used to make them captive to a product. It's to help them. And the key thing about CRISPR to me is it takes genetic editing out of the purview of a multi-million-dollar lab. And you can set up a CRISPR laboratory for relatively $1,000 or a little more dollars in your own kitchen.
Yeah.
And start messing around with genetic editing. I was up at a TED event in Banff, Canada this past year where they had people edit bacteria to imbue it with bioluminescence. And it wasn't hard. And that is, it really is like taking genetic editing and, like the internet, spreading it around the world. We'll see individual communities and groups and people possibly editing organisms to help themselves.
Yeah, it's a huge democratization.
Yes,
Whereas
yes.
we used to see the kind of work that you can now do with CRISPR only happening in private universities and
right.
Ivy League facilities.
Or corporate facilities,
Or
too.
corporate facilities. And even then, it would take 10 times as long
Yes.
to do. Now you can do it in a fraction of the time for a fraction of the money. So public universities are able to have
Yes.
this
Community
ability.
colleges.
Community college. Maybe even high school eventually you'll be able to do these kinds of projects, which is really great.
Well, how 21st century is that? There's the iGEM competition, which I believe is still being run out of MIT, at George Church, where they have college student teams competing to see who can design the best synthetic life form. And that sounds
That's
so
amazing.
sci-fi.
I know. That's so cool. Craig Venter must be really proud. Yeah. And, speaking to GMOs, because I think that is a huge application that, obviously your book is not about GMOs. It's about a genetically engineered human.
Correct.
But we talk about that a lot on this show and also on another show I work on, The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. And myself, and I think I'm safe to speak for the other 4 guys on that show, are major advocates of genetic modification technology because the technology itself is incredible. I think one of the biggest tragedies of the 21st century has been, or maybe it was the 20th century when this happened.
I know. They're happening faster.
It's so crazy. Has been golden rice. It's such a bummer that golden rice was killed for these sort of political and fear, these reasons of fear. I get why people are afraid of Monsanto. I mean, Agent Orange is still fresh in many people's minds, and it's
And
hard
secrecy
to
does not help.
Secrecy doesn't help. And, the idea of sort of a large agribusiness owning, like you said, this intellectual property over seeds, some people think that is an ethical quandary for them, and I understand that.
Yeah.
But
that's separate of
that's
the
separate
technology
than the technology,
itself.
and people
Correct.
don't. They often throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah.
But the type of genetic modification that's happening in agro labs across the country is astounding. And I don't think for much longer it's only going to be the staple crops. I think we're going to start seeing all of these kind of exotic, different types of fruits and vegetables.
Well, think
and
about
plants coming out.
cellular agriculture is a great example. And for those unfamiliar with it, is again, if we use synthetic biology to create meat or milk or other products instead of, let's say, growing the full-blown cow, this creates actually a quandary for vegans, because if they're against cruelty, well, there's no cruelty involved here. There's no suffering. But what I find most interesting about a company like Memphis Meats, for instance, which does cultured meats, is this idea that you could have a more diverse stock of meat being grown.
Totally. I say all the time, I really want to try zebra.
Yeah, but you won't harm zebra.
No,
but more than
I won't
that,
feel bad about
20,
it.
30, 40, 500 varieties of beef that might otherwise have disappeared.
Yeah, you can make the fat content could be scientific. You go to the store and you get 70%, 80%, 90%, and you're like, is it really? But here it's like, in order to grow this meat, you culture the fat, you culture the blood vessels, you culture the muscle, and you mix it all together.
For 1% of the use of the land and 10% of the necessary water it would be to raise a cow.
And no methane.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's the other thing. No, much less climate impact, but it freaks people out. And I think it freaks people out, to me, if you can look at that meat and say, hey, this is genetically essentially identical to the meat you're eating. And that's really what it comes down to. Is I like to term DNA as biology in general as the original open source. Anybody can take it and test it and see what it is. And that's what I really am hoping we're getting from this coming revolution in both manufacturing and food production, is very much a transparent system where people educate themselves about it and see the benefit of it and how exciting it is, both from a jobs point of view, a sustainable society and economy. All of these things, but it's going to require some involvement.
Yeah.
And that's why I really think the anti-GMO movement in general needs to evolve. To turn a phrase, it needs to change, because I think a lot of the resistance was against these hidden labs that have an agenda that has nothing to do, perhaps, with what families and individual people are concerned about.
And even the farmers, I've interviewed many farmers, production farmers, and asked them, do you feel like you're forced to buy GM crops? And it's like, no, I buy them because I have a way bigger yield.
Yeah.
It's like these things were modified so that they're drought tolerant. They were modified so that they, withstand pests.
Yeah.
It's like I use all of these products. I use the glyphosate on my glyphosate or on my crops that are ready for it because I can sell more crops that way, and they're
I always look at the
healthy.
captive market part.
Yeah.
And that is that, again, the idea that a population, the idea that a population might be stuck purchasing an entire system that is not necessarily right for the environment. I think there's always this, when it comes to industrial agriculture, this impetus to make things uniform.
Yeah.
Because that makes them highly efficient.
Yeah.
And again, I spent 18 years working in software, and a good deal of that time was in designing logistics systems. So I'm very familiar with the efficiencies for making things similar and uniform. But what I love most about this, what we're talking about with CRISPR and genetic editing, synthetic biology, is, again, bringing the richness of diversity back into both our food system and as well as our manufacturing base, growing products as opposed to stamping them out in a factory.
And even growing them at home.
Growing them at home.
Yeah, we always talk
Nature
about...
is a 3D printer. We've both been 3D printed by our mothers. So
Yes!
I think it was, I'm trying to remember, that was from a TED Talk, and I'm trying to remember the name of the guy who said it, but I laughed so hard when he said, your mother is the ultimate 3D printer.
And honestly, that I was going to say, we've been genetically modified for 200,000 years. Like, anytime somebody chooses a mate based on anything other than pure genetic drive.
That's right, which is a little creepy.
Yeah, which we're human beings. Like, societal and cultural and psychological influences are almost greater for us than our, pure kind of genetic influences. We do non-assortive mating all the time, and so we are affecting the not just the genome of our immediate offspring, but the kind of entire genetic pool that's available. And of course, we all know that babies are smarter and more beautiful and more interesting the more mixed they become.
Diversity, nature leans towards diversity for a
Absolutely.
reason.
Yeah. The more that you're inbreeding, the more problems you have.
Exactly.
We generally
There's
try
ample
to
evidence for that.
Exactly. Yeah. Just look at the royals or the population.
I didn't want to say that, but now that you said it, I'll just nod vigorously. Yeah.
Or the population of panthers in
All I
Florida.
can say is when Lady Diana came in, they got a lot more attractive.
Absolutely. They have some, and there's some attractive kids
Did I really
that came out
join
of
this
that.
podcast to start railing on the royals?
It's fine. We're in the U.S. And I bet you the kinds of listeners that are in the U.K. are not big fans of the monarchy.
Royalty is not a thing with me.
No.
But I'm not at risk of becoming knighted anytime soon. So.
That's true, yeah. Otherwise, I would say speak carefully.
Yeah.
But so this is how many, you are a best-selling author. How many books have you written at this point?
This is number 5.
Number 5. We were making tea earlier and just kind of chatting, and I was saying, I hate writing. I have to do it a lot of times for my job. I hate it. And then you, of course, said what I have always thought, which is...
Well, I like having written more than writing.
I feel the same way.
Yeah.
The sense of accomplishment you get when you're finished, there's nothing like it.
Well, sometimes I would look at, I had my books that I'd written stacked on a shelf sideways, and I looked at it, I thought, God, that looks like a lot of work.
And you're like, it was.
At least there's some evidence of it.
And your wife can, of course, attest to that.
Oh, yes, she can. I think it's probably more work for her in a way. It's just putting up with me while I'm doing it.
And so because you've written 5 books and because you're a best-selling author, I assume, I could be wrong, that you're able to do this as your full-time job now.
Yeah.
How long into the process were you able to kind of quit your day job and really start calling yourself and focusing as a full-time author?
My situation was by no means typical.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened was I had a software consultancy in L.A. It was successful, and I had big, Fortune 1000 clients, again, designing logistics systems. And I became more and more interested in IT security during that process because I had to make sure that the products that I designed were not vulnerable to things that would get me sued.
Sure.
Or cause massive losses for my clients. And what that started to mean was I would go to things like DEF CON for many years. And I just found it so damn interesting. I could just hang out there forever. And hacking in general, the idea of undermining systems was really kind of cool to me. And really, it's all part of understanding how things work. And I think there's no better way to understand, let's say, how a lock works than by picking it.
It's true.
And so this really developed an interest in IT security. And that's what resulted in my first book, Demon. Because that was a synthesis of a lot of things I was concerned about the monoculture we were building. Remember, I was talking just a little while ago about having uniform, highly efficient systems. The trick about systems like that is that they're very fragile to disruptions. And what I was becoming increasingly concerned about was us building that. And how do we make society resilient? And all this sounds very dry. So I wanted to make a really cool, thrilling story about that. And that's what I did with Demon as a sideline while I was still working. And I self-published
so you
it.
were double time there.
Yeah, I'd spend the evenings writing a book, because in hindsight, it's just miraculous that I had the time or discipline to do it.
So
But
you self-published that book?
yeah, in 2006. Now, I finished it in 2004, so I spent about a year and a half trying to find an agent. So I always... Now, if I chuckle, if you ask me how to find an agent, it's not because I'm laughing at you. I'm laughing at myself. And that is, I have no idea how to find an agent.
I know, isn't it? It's such a funny thing. It's the same in Hollywood. People ask me, too, like, what's your advice about? And I'm like, unfortunately, you kind of already have to have a job before you can get, which is a weird...
They need to come to you, it turns out.
Yeah, it's true.
So what happened was again, my wife, Michelle, and I, she's great, helped me design a marketing plan for this. And since I couldn't find an agent, what we did was we reached out to tech bloggers and journalists that I would read all the time and whose work I was familiar with and said, hey, I've got this book. I'll give you a copy. You can use it to level a coffee table if you want, but I'm going to give it to you. You don't have to do anything. And fortunately, a good number of them responded, and a good number of those really enjoyed the book. And if there was any lesson I was going to say to anybody who's an aspiring writer is that you don't have to go out and find your whole audience.
Yeah.
You do have to find the one or two people who will connect you to your whole audience. And that's, in my case, what happened. So two people, Rick Clow and Stuart Brand, up in Silicon Valley, they really conveyed my book to places I could not bring it. And there were a number of other people, too, but those were probably the first ones. And from there, Wired Magazine picked it up, I think, in 2007. They did an article on it, and then I started selling tons of books.
That's so you, even after you published, there was a lull for you where you weren't even sure.
Yeah, okay,
if it
ready
was gonna
again,
take
aspiring
off.
writers. Oh, let me see, I think it was 8 months.
Yeah.
That's just pretty insufferable.
Just
you
long
love
enough
this
to-
resounding silence when you do your big magnum opus. Ta-da!
Just long
Nothing.
enough to feel
Crickets.
like, okay, this is done. And
Yeah.
then all of a sudden,
Yeah.
because that's the thing, your work lives on even after you do, right?
It does.
And so it's
well,
out there.
You know what, you say that. What's interesting about you saying that exact phrase is that Demon is really about a person who is deceased and who leaves something behind looking for the appearance of his obituary, which triggers all of these processes to begin running. And where that idea came from, this is the geek part of me, is I was a big D&D or RPG tabletop gamer.
Nice.
And when I was working on all this Y2K remediation stuff and a lot of logistics software, I wanted a creative outlet, and I was interested in doing some software for the tabletop market. And I was a shareholder at Hasbro at the time, and I think it was Ryan Dancy, the brand manager for D&D, that I talked to, and I said, hey, what's your feeling about software? What software is in demand? And I don't know if have you tabletop gamed much?
So I've done quite a bit of tabletop gaming, not generally role play games,
Okay.
but I have dated many a boy.
Okay, then you know.
So I have played D&D enough times in my
So
life.
here's the thing about it. It fractures. That market, there's every single table has its own house rules.
Yep.
And so writing software for it is tricky.
It's hard, and there's like the new books that people write and the iterations
Yeah, the
and
addendums
iterations.
and on and on.
Yeah.
And so what I did was I thought, what I did in my campaign, and I moderated a campaign for about 8 years, 8 to 10 years, depending. But weather generation was something that I found interesting because if you think about it, in all these great mythological epics, weather, the Odysseus gets waylaid by storms and things like that. And I didn't see weather being used a lot in games, and it can have such a traumatic impact on
Absolutely.
story and how things go. And so I created a rather comprehensive software system for developing weather. And into it, I also put an orbital mechanics module that would tell you when the sun would rise and set anywhere on your planet every day of the year on your fictitious world. And you could have multiple moons. It would tell you the cycles of the moon. It was way over designed because that's kind of how I rolled.
But that's awesome, and I'm sure people loved it.
Well, it was called Weathermaster, and I think the Russians eventually hacked into it. I also got carried away. This was around the year 2000. No, it was 1999.
Y2K.
Yeah, well, again, man, that was a high-pressure time. So this was
Yep.
my blowing off steam thing. And so I put a polymorphic encryption wrapper around it, and then I made it so you could buy it and try it for 30 days and then use a credit card to buy it. And then I got pulled into Y2K remediation stuff from a real pressure cooker. And I didn't get a chance to look back on how it was performing for like 2 months, maybe 3 months. And I saw all this money in the account. And I saw that I had sold Weathermaster automatically, had it spread around the world into 38 countries. And it occurred to me, if I kick the bucket, this thing's going to keep going.
Yeah.
Because it's going to pay for its website. It's going to pay for its advertising. It was all set up. It would just keep rolling. And I started thinking, hey, what else could you do in the modern world if you're dead? The answer really isn't demon, and the answer is quite a bit, actually. So,
I love that.
So that book came out, and eventually Dutton, which is an imprint of what's now Penguin Random House, they got in touch with me.
Yeah, I was going to say, were you able to then kind of go the pro route after? I've seen that with a lot of authors where they'll self-publish first, and then once it really starts to succeed, then a publisher will come along so they can take 30%.
It's funny you say that.
Actually, that's your agent.
No, what it is, not that high. And don't give them ideas. No, but here's the thing about that. At the time, this is 2007, early 2008, all these agents were calling me.
Yeah.
Many of whom had rejected me or just ignored me previously.
Interesting.
Fortunately, I had worked right out of college in publishing in New York, so I actually had to work a rejection pile. So I knew that it was not coming from animosity. It's just the statistics. And now more than ever, really, the question for a publisher is, what audience do you have? It's great if we like that, but what's your audience?
Yeah, I've had offers too from literary agents and from book publishers, and I'm just not quite ready to write. But I'm working in other aspects of it. But a big part of it, they always say, is like you have a built-in social media following.
Exactly.
That's really important.
It's huge.
And then also kind of who do you know that could blurb your book?
Yep.
It's like who in this world would be willing to read it and give it their stamp of approval because they're already reading their books.
Yes.
That's a big part of
it.
it.
And it is a business. Mm-hmm. And this is the sausage making that goes on behind the scenes. So I was very grateful for the time that I'd spent in publishing because it made me realistic and also not to have this automatic high horse animosity of the people who had originally rejected me because I got it. The reason why I went the other way was so that I could answer that question. Mm-hmm. And so when all these agents were getting in touch with me, I would ask them, well, I'm selling thousands of books, sometimes a day now.
Yeah.
So what can you offer me that I'm not already doing? Because I have it set up with Ingram. It was print on demand. They're co-located across the street from Amazon. We can ship. I don't have to lift a finger. So what do you offer me? And most of them really didn't, in 2006 or 2007, have a good answer to that question.
Yeah.
But one agent did. And they said, in response to that question, why don't I fly you out to New York and put you in front of all the biggest editors in town and you can ask them? I thought, that's a hell of a good answer.
Yeah.
And it turns out, at the time, the answer was foreign distribution, support, translations, audiobook, and marketing.
And probably also a deal for more books.
Yes, it was a 2-book deal.
Yeah.
And it gave me the freedom to then write the sequel to Demon. Mm-hmm. And it turned out to be good enough that it actually made sense for me to initially put my business on hiatus and eventually mothball it.
Oh, that's wonderful.
My contracts over to other people, which was unbelievable. You have to remember what time we're talking about here. This was 2008. Mm-hmm. Now, fortunately, my business was still okay, but things are bad when writing a novel seems like a sound economic decision.
I know. That was the bubble. That was right at the bubble.
But it also helped that a lot of what Demon was about was that type of disruption. So really, it was a perfect storm of good for me, and not so much for everybody else.
Yeah, yeah. And that is unfortunately sometimes the best way to play the game, even if you're doing it accidentally.
Yeah. No, you just look like I meant to do that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so since then you've written 4 other books. You wrote the sequel and then 2 more and then now Change Agent.
Yeah, so Kill Decision, Influx, and now Change Agent, and I'm working on number 6, all with the same publisher.
Oh, that's amazing.
My publisher has been actually very good.
And so do you tend to write at home? Do you tend to are you a coffee shop writer? Do you like to take little sabbaticals to cabins in the woods? How do you go about it?
All of the above.
Yeah.
All of the above. Although whenever I'm sitting in Starbucks, I have this self-conscious attitude like everybody's thinking I'm sitting here trying to be a writer.
Writing a screenplay.
But I am actually a writer. Yeah. But I feel like such a poser. So I'll typically go up to Big Bear or out to the desert or something to get a place.
But I feel that way at Starbucks around here, too. It's easy.
Don't you feel like a faker? You're
it's easy to go into Starbucks and be like, all these people working on their spec scripts. But then it's like, a lot of times you don't know what the like super famous writers actually look like.
Yeah. In this part of town, probably half of them are working screenwriters.
So you're like, okay, I probably shouldn't be too flippant about that.
Yeah. But yeah, I try to mix it up. I do, when it comes to crunch time, I'm at home so that I have a reliable infrastructure that I know so I can really get things together. But when I'm in the early stages, so I don't know how you write, I typically break it up where it's about a third of the time is structure and character and what this is going to be about. And again, maybe it's my software background, but structure is very important to me because if you're writing software and you're just kind of winging it, that's how you have bugs.
Yeah.
And I don't like have any bugs in my story unless the story is about bugs. So the other part is research. About a third of it is research, which is, to me, the most fun part. And that's
So you
why,
like reporting?
well,
That's
I like
great.
researching things and contacting people. This is one of the superpowers you acquire when you get on like the New York Times bestseller list. Is you can call somebody at the Hoover Dam and say, "Hey, I'd like to see the turbos," and they Google you, and then they say, "Oh, come on down."
Yeah.
And when I did the sequel to Demon, I did so much more research. I probably did enough for 4 books because, of course, this was the first time I was writing a book under deadline. I thought, "Oh, this is great." Drove all over the Midwest, talked to all these various people, and it was super interesting. But most of that just wound up on metaphorically, the cutting room floor.
But at least it's still in your mind.
It is.
Yes, you can
and
always
it was an
use it
enriching
later.
experience.
Yes.
But when you're under a deadline, that enriching experience is somewhat less enriching. So I've learned enough to spend a third of the time, and then about a third of it is the actual writing of the book.
Gotcha.
Because once you've organized everything, you know what you want to say, and you know what business each sentence and chapter has to do, you can get on with it, and it works.
I think the most frustrating thing for me about writing is that I tend to. I've noticed this about myself. Well, there's 2 things. One of them, I've talked to many writers, and they've said, that means you're a writer, because I'm the same way. And other people say, that's totally unhealthy, and you need to work around that, including my shrink. So that one thing I'm talking about would be that I fall in. And I don't realize that the sun has set. I'm just
You're
going.
You're in the zone.
And I forget to pee, and I forget to eat, and then my legs are cramping, and
it's working.
Yeah, and it's but at the same time, I'm like, that's probably not good. And the problem with that is that it's almost hard for me to write if I can't fall in, and so I don't know how to do the healthy thing where I write for 30 minutes at a time and then I get up and walk away.
Yeah, I'm not so sure that's
healthier.
Everybody writes differently.
It's true.
And whatever works for you, keep doing that.
Yeah,
Because I do something similar. I like a 12-hour uninterrupted block of time. For the programmers in this audience, I will say, when you come back to a complex project and you have to refamiliarize yourself with the variables and the classes and say, okay, what am I doing here? Where are all the pieces I need? And it takes a while to get into the driver's seat of that project.
Yes.
And once you're there, stay there
need to
until
stay
you're
there.
exhausted. That's the way it works for me.
I get it. Okay, that's good to know. Because the other thing that I tend to do is I tend to keep rereading. It's like I'll go back to the beginning of the chapter, or I'll go back to the beginning of the new section, and I'll read it to see where I am so that I can keep going. And it's like, I'm wasting so much time.
No, you're not. No, how many times have you written something that you spent hours, days on, and you wind up tossing it, and then later you write something in 5 minutes and it's the best thing you've ever written? You never know. And the more time you're there concentrating on it, the better chance you have of getting in the zone. And there's really no predicting. I suppose there's doing things with a minimum level of professionalism and capability, which you can do every time you sit in the seat. But you know what I'm talking about. When you are in the zone and you just have dialed it in, and you are really getting at your best self in your writing, that's going to be rare. And the more times you're sitting in that seat, the better opportunity you have to do that. So for me, I have a tendency to write fat. And what I don't mean physically, although God knows that's probably true too. But meaning I overwrite. I write more than I need, and then I go back and I do a brutal edit with a machete.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that I'm most grateful for is the ability to gain perspective on what I've written once it cools off.
Yeah.
And to be able to go back and say, wow, what was I thinking here?
And that's not easy for a lot of people.
It isn't.
They call it killing your darlings.
Yes, what was that? William Goldman.
Yeah.
Killing your children, I think is what he called it. It's even more alarming.
And it's really hard for some people. That's why a lot of people need a really tough editor.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And fortunately, I have a really good editor on top of it. But for me, I think I save us all a lot of trouble by getting rid of almost all of the real stinker lines or concepts or what have you. I've done some things as late as the second draft, completely revise a character because it's not working.
Yeah.
But the ability to honestly see your own writing, I think, is one of the most important skills, I'd say that. Yeah, I don't even know if I would call it a skill. How about abilities to tolerate, as it can be painful.
And it must come, with practice and with time. Same as getting into the zone. I would assume that the longer that you do this professionally, the easier it is for you to kind of mentally, psychologically, cognitively find all of those little kind of quirks that are comfortable. Get yourself in the right head. You know that you need that cup of tea. You know that the lights have to be just so. Exactly.
For me.
Yeah, you know that like if there's too much traffic on the street that day, you're not going to be able to focus. Or if your desk is too messy, you might, it's all those different things.
I don't know. I look at things like that. And again, everyone's different. I try not to lean on that type of thing. That's tough. Why sometimes I go to write in public.
Sure.
Simply because you have to toughen up. You have to say, I can't say, it's too humid in here.
That's so me.
Is there a lot of ozone in this room? You can find some excuse to say, no, I think I'll go play, Rust all day. The hell with this. No, you can't do that.
It's hard, right?
Especially when you're under a deadline. You have to really treat it as a profession, and that's what it is.
Yeah.
You have to get it done, and the sooner you get it done, the sooner you get a chance to put it down, have it cool off, and come back with a fresh perspective, as if you're some other reader. And that is where a good editor really helps, and I've been very fortunate with Dutton. I've had some great editors. Ben Sevier was a guy who discovered me, and he has been promoted, and he's now in charge. I'm trying to remember. I don't want to say the label because I might get it wrong.
But now he's like an executive,
he's a big
like
dude,
he does. Yeah,
and he's great to work with. And now Jess Renheim is my editor at Dutton, but I worked with her on Change Agent, and she was great. I worked with both of them during that transition. I've been very fortunate, both with the publisher and with editors.
That's wonderful. So I have to ask, as an individual who does this professionally, and a big part of your work, because you write sci-fi, but you're interested and really focused on ensuring that the science is as accurate as possible, you must read a lot of nonfiction.
Yes, I do.
I read a lot of nonfiction. If you turn around and see my bookshelf, it's like
That's
all
nonfiction. That's the first thing I
nonfiction.
looked at.
Yeah, and the bummer thing about only reading nonfiction is that I often feel like I'm missing something in my life. I know it's so important to read fiction. You write fiction, and it's so important. It allows, a creative part of yourself to come out. Absolutely.
And under less rigor than you would be, let's say, if you were a scientist or a physicist doing stuff. That's why sometimes when I do research with like with Influx, or with this book, with geneticists, when I'm talking to scientists, they are sometimes uncomfortable or nervous, like, well, okay, hang on. I'm not saying that's going to happen. It could happen.
Oh, we're very conservative in the tone.
Well, understandably.
Yeah.
When you're talking about peer review, you want to be very careful about having some statement that you supposedly made taken out of context. And one of the great gifts of being a fiction writer, and again, I wouldn't even say that I'm a sci-fi writer per se, and I say that mostly because technology has such a central place in all of our lives that I'd say sci-fi writing is writing at this point.
That's true.
And so I write high-tech thrillers, sci-fi thrillers, I write thrillers, I write mainstream commercial fiction. How's that? But basically, I have a little more license. I have poetic license, valid poetic license to project a little further and to do some what-ifs that you can't do purely if you're a scientist. So that's why I call it prototyping. And it is a wonderful experience. It just, to try to make it adhere to both rationality, science, logic, you have to do a lot of homework. And it does involve reading a lot of nonfiction, which fortunately I've always done and really enjoyed. I've always enjoyed fiction. It's probably the reason why I always wanted to be a novelist, is I enjoyed so much fiction in the past. But in order to really lay a good foundation for it, I find I have to read a lot of nonfiction.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not knocking that at all. Obviously, it's the bulk of what I read.
Oh, I didn't think you were.
Yeah. And to anybody listening, like, just read. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Just read.
Yeah, whatever you're reading.
Exactly.
Read it.
That's very important. But sometimes I do find that I look at my Amazon cart and I'm like, why are there no novels in here? Like, what is it? So I've been trying to take a more active, choice and being at least one. And I look at, the Pulitzer list and different New York Times bestselling lists. And it intentionally, maybe for every 5 books I read that are nonfiction, I force myself to read a novel.
I'm laughing because I freaked out about the exact same thing, I think 2 days ago. But then I have to tell myself I get sent a lot of books.
That's
from
true.
People
Me too.
want to blurb.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, that's the reason I didn't buy it.
Yeah.
But I looked at it like literally the last 40 books.
I know. What is that?
Yeah, I have a problem. I have a science problem.
But that's great. It's so much fun, isn't it? That there is so much amazing literature out there.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, this is one of those areas where you will never run out.
No.
And
well, I wouldn't say it makes my job easy, but it certainly helps enrich it. So I have a reading list at the back of every single book I've ever written.
Oh, cool.
It contains lists of nonfiction books. In case you are curious about the ideas and concepts and technologies, read this.
Oh, that's so great. I get that a lot from listeners of the show asking for recommendations.
yeah.
And sometimes I think I just got one the other day, a tweet that was like, I'm interested in science. What should I read? And I'm like, oh God, what
Science,
aspect of
wow.
science? Yeah. It's like, oh my God, there's so much out there. And we all have our favorites, you know. Do you have a favorite nonfiction author?
Well, I'm going to go ways back for this. For the person who really just lit my mind on fire is Carl Sagan.
Oh, yeah.
Back in the day, Cosmos, both the documentary and Cosmos, the book. I mean, I think I was probably 9 or 10 years old asking
wonderful.
for that big, coffee table book, Cosmos. And my parents looking at it like, are you sure? Oh, yeah. And I loved it because, again, all of the things that he covered just laid down such a great foundation for inquiry and everything else after that. And
It's
it
true.
just gave me this just love for science and respect for it and how exciting it is. Because it's not, okay, it is boring perhaps if you're going for a PhD because it's got such a laser focus. That can be tedious sometimes going through all that to get to that revelation.
Absolutely.
But the sum total of all scientific inquiry is absolutely awe-inspiring. And as a civilian, let's say, not a practitioner, you get the ability to survey the entire terrain. And it is so cool.
You get to see the forest.
Yeah.
I mean, it's true. When you're really in it and you're not just on a tree, you're on a branch, you're on a little branch, and you're actually at the cell, and that's all you see for like weeks on end.
And I talk to scientists who do stuff like dig bugs out of monkey shit all day. And that part of science is probably not so fun.
But when you take a step back,
stuff.
and you realize in the grand scheme of things, the biome, the ecosystem, the universe as a whole, how incredibly like awe-inspiring.
Doesn't it blow you away?
Every time I stop and think about it.
We have derived this knowledge through all this hard effort. The fact that we know, what the sun is, what it's made of, how it works, the orbits of the planets, the galaxy bacteria,
We know exactly how
electricity.
old the Earth is. That's crazy.
There's this great book. It's called, now I'm going to try to remember the name of it. It's by Carl Sagan. I think it's called A Candle in the Darkness.
Oh, yeah, I have it up there.
See now, that is great. Now, what
is
I
it
love
the
about
Demon Haunted World?
Demon Haunted World.
Yes,
Thank
yes,
you.
yes,
God,
yes.
you would think I would know that. My first book was called Different Demon.
Yeah, exactly.
But
Spelled differently, too.
Yes, it is. But that book is wonderful because it talks about all these superstitions that we had, and you think about how incredibly courageous these scientists were at the time. Burned at the stake. If you try to point out, hey, guys, I know we're supposed to be afraid of the darkness and having our souls, but what if? And they kept doing that, peeling back the layers of reality and helping us understand and putting us in charge of our own existence. I mean, how many people are afraid of the dark now? At night, not many.
Yeah, not many. Because
we
got flashlights.
Incredible. Yes, we do. We literally force the darkness back.
We literally can see it. Yeah.
And that is, to me, one of the best achievements ever. So that's why I find it very useful and interesting in my work to lay down a nice foundation of science because I find it so fascinating.
I love that. I think that's so wonderful. And it's such a good and practical example of why science is so important, even for individuals who aren't, planning to endeavor in science. I don't think your lifelong goal has been to join a lab and work at the bench all day.
No, but to extol the virtues of that type of activity.
Absolutely.
Part of the research I was doing for my second book entailed at one point being in an evangelical church, one of those mega churches. I won't state what state or where it was, but I remember thinking as I was sitting in the audience listening to this individual expound these medieval beliefs, because that, in this case, was what they were doing, literally medieval beliefs. But he was doing so with the aid of a 40-foot digital toroid screen. Yeah. I just thought the irony here.
Seriously.
It's like, wow.
I know. It's pretty funny how often we forget how much science goes into our technology.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Just how we often think of these tools that we have at our disposal, gadgets, if you will, but there's so much more than gadgets.
They become extensions of us personally.
Yes, and we think of them as just existing out of thin air, as if like, how did I get my iPhone? How did I get my computer? How did I get this recording device that we're producing this podcast?
Oh, that's
with?
right. Yeah, it's right in front of my face.
Right.
Literally,
it's on our ears. It's in front of our mouth, and we so often just think of these tools as almost like natural outcroppings.
Yes.
They're not. These are things that brilliant minds painstakingly worked and had to know math and physics to be able to produce.
Agreed. And isn't it interesting how quickly the plasticity of the human mind is so amazing that we do treat them like extensions of us? That we can, and there was a great documentary again in the 80s, 70s. It was called The Body in Question, I think it was. And one episode in particular stuck with me because the doctor was trying to parallel park, and as he bumped into a car, he winced. And
as if it hurt.
Yes, as if it hurt. And what he's saying is it's amazing how we can extend our being, our senses, and feel as if we're part of something that's not part of us. How does that work physiologically? I thought that was so cool.
And what's even more amazing is that these scientists, technologists, engineers, computer scientists know that about our psychology and actually produce these things to make it easier, this kind of the aesthetic, what do they call it? To make something more user-friendly.
User
Apple
design?
Yeah, Apple is so good
user
at that.
Experience,
UX.
UX.
Yeah, your user experience is so natural that you don't even have to learn how to use the buttons. They just make sense to you intuitively.
When was the last time you read a manual?
I know, never. But I save them for some reason.
Do they even have manuals
A
still?
lot of kitchen appliances do. And then you open the box, and for whatever you're like, oh, I'll need this warranty. Like that's ever going to happen. I have a stack of them in my kitchen.
You're not helping me with my wife. I'm always the person who says, no, we're keeping this. And we're keeping the box too, just in case.
But it's like, you can just Google it. You know that, right? It's online. But for some reason, old habits die hard. That's true. There's a comfort in that, I think. Yeah. Well, Dan, this has been so much fun.
Likewise.
I'd love to ask you a couple questions because I close every episode asking my guests the same two questions.
Oh boy, I should have done more research then, I'd be totally prepared.
It's better when you're not prepared. It's funny because I'm on episode 100. I don't remember.
Are you kidding me? Wow,
150 something at this point.
That's great.
And,
congratulations.
Thank you. And I've never done anything with these final two questions, but when I forget to ask, listeners are like,
this will be when I'm running for Senate like 20 years from now. It's like, damn
it, why did
I answer that?
So honestly. And so, so I'm going to ask you them in order simply because the first one often elicits a very depressing response and the second one often is more uplifting. And they're two sides of the same coin. It's really about the future. You think about the future a lot.
I do.
And you think about it in many different contexts. So I want you to pick a context. It could be your own personal future, the future of your family, or it could be the future of America or of the globe or of mankind or, the extraterrestrial kind. But when you think about the future in whatever context that resonates with you, first, what is the thing, if you had to pick one, that is like the most worrisome to you, the most disconcerting, the thing that you find yourself staying up at night worrying about? And then on the flip side of that, what are you really, kind of hopeful and excited and optimistic about?
Okay. And those are the two questions?
Those are the two questions, yeah.
I would say the thing that I worry about most about the future is our slipping into the past, falling into superstition and ignorance again. That worries me more than any technology that is coming up by far. Isn't
it funny because it's like the easiest thing to avoid because you just have to read.
You would think that there's also abundant evidence that learning and reading and adherence to science have accrued so many benefits to us. They have doubled the lifespan. Now I'm just picking one of a million benefits. And it's interesting. And then there's fractiousness in society and politics and everything else that can really conspire. And I mean conspire in the sense of probability, to coincide, to undermine what is really a remarkable possibility for us. Because I think it is very much within our grasp that everybody alive be able to eat and have a decent life. It is definitely within our grasp.
Absolutely.
And of course, it's not true right now, but I think it logistically could be done if we reprioritize what we're doing. And so if we, Like, for instance, when I think about the tremendous feats we're capable of now in space, going into space, how fragile that is. If we have enough discord on Earth, we may lose our ability to go to space. Both being able to fund it or have the peacefulness to have these facilities and specialties required to do it.
We see it all the time. We think about the ISS and the fact that we no longer have the shuttle. We have to use the Soyuz. And our political relations with Russia right now are so tenuous.
Yes. And it's remarkable that in 2017, especially if you lived through when the wall came down, and you're thinking, okay, now. Now, I also look at photographs of the Russian space shuttle lying in ruins in a weed-encrusted facility, thinking, that's a very thin line.
Oh, absolutely.
And so I am most concerned about drifting into the past and into superstition being the thing that makes decisions.
It's funny. I guess I have to ask before we move on to the more hopeful thoughts. Do you think... I'm kind of thinking about this thermodynamically, which I'm not sure if that's the right way to do it.
This ought to be interesting.
Right? Do you think that the default nature is a drifting towards conservatism and towards kind of regressivism? Or do you think that all things being equal, we would progress, but there's active political intention to go backward? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I tend to think the latter, that actually there's a natural progression that occurs as we accumulate knowledge, but there's individual forces that are powerful.
Inertia.
Yeah, that push against that and cause the kind of regression that we're seeing.
All right. See, the reason I was preparing
I
myself
saw there's a wink.
This is a subject that I have thought long and hard about and also spoken to many people about. And one of the books, actually, this is a book that was recommended to me by, I won't even say his name just in case he doesn't want, but he was a very cool tech dude. And he recommended this book to me. It was written in the 1960s. And I think his name was Carol Quigley. I might have the name wrong. But the name of the book is Evolution of Civilizations.
Evolution of Civilizations.
Now, what this book, and again, to add to your nonfiction book collection, what this book is about is the concept that any civilization rises because the society has some benefit that allows them to cohere as a society and pursue some common interest or goal. It's typically some advantage, whether it's the lateen sale or the ability to sell spices of a certain variety or some scientific invention or any or all of the above. But he collectively calls this their instrument. And that instrument of their civilization, their advantage, is guarded by a group, whether it's high priests or specialists who's like, look, we have to preserve this. This is the thing that we're known for. And over time, what happens is things change. But the cast of people who are there to preserve it and keep things from changing resist change.
God, I'm seeing that with the Industrial Revolution, the auto industry.
Does this immediately sound like, yes, that's it?
And what happens is it's no longer relevant.
That's right.
But
and
we're
yet,
not willing to change.
The institution that grows up to preserve that instrument sustains because, of course, any institution, it immediately sets about preserving itself. And so this is what prevents us from effecting these changes. So what Carol Quigley did was he studied the 24, I think it's 25 past civilizations and analyzed it in this regard. Like, what brought them down?
So he was looking at the Romans and the Greeks.
The Mayans, you go,
gotcha.
and it's really remarkable that it's a resistance to change. It's the inertia from past decisions and the unwillingness or inability to shift things without coming apart at the seams.
Yeah.
And this lies at the heart, I think, of all of our challenges and what would pull us back and prevent us from moving forward. And so I'd recommend it to anybody who really wants to get a handle on what's going on. Now, Carol Quigley was an historian from Princeton who worked with the State Department. And in a more enlightened time, and by enlightened when I say that, for certain people.
Sure.
Not so pleasant for others. But my point is from a State Department time, this is what I mean, you'll see when I describe it. They hired him to educate every single U.S. diplomat who went out into the world. So if you were ambassador, you had to take his class.
Shut up.
Yeah,
and now you don't even have to take an ethics class.
Now I don't think you even have to know how to read.
Exactly. You don't have to know the country that you are the ambassador to.
And so, but think about it. That's what I meant when I said a more enlightened time, that whoever made that decision to really understand at its root the spine of what makes a civilization and how their trajectories have worked over. I mean, that's a really important thing for an ambassador to think about. So highly recommend that book. It's a question that I thought about many, many times. And I think at its heart, that's what Demon, my first book, was really about. How do you make a society that is resilient and accepting of necessary change while still preserving itself as a civilization? It's really, and I think technology offers us some possibilities there. And again, it's affecting the change.
Yeah, and I wonder how much of that is so deeply ingrained, how much of it is a personality style, how much of it is, because you do see a rift, right? You see people like fall into these little categories. Like you've got the progressives and you've got the conservatives. And it's like, why is it that this group of people are so passionate about moving forward and this group of people are so passionate about staying the course?
How long is your podcast?
Right, exactly.
If you got 6 hours, man, I tell you, I think about this a lot. It's really at the heart of things. And a good deal of it is manufactured. And there's manufacturing consent and there's manufacturing dissent. It's on both sides. And I'm not saying both sides are equal either. I'm just saying that there's definitely some people who aren't necessarily on the stage who have it in their interest for democracy to be scrambled and for us to not have as much influence over our government. And again, this is as old as the hills. It goes back to Rome.
It's not conspiratorial thinking.
No, and not at all. It's
true.
a system. I always like to think of it this way, that any system that gets set up, you don't need a conspiracy in order to mess with a system. Mm-hmm. You set up a system, let's say whether it's capitalism, a system of rewards that encourage certain behavior and punish other behaviors. And that's at its heart. The inputs and outputs of that system affect the trajectory of society. So notice how I have not mentioned the necessity for any conspiracy. It's just that we have set it up and modified the system such that, and when I say we, society, that lobbyists and other people have more influence in government. Absolutely. That's not a radical statement.
No, and unfortunately there's this historic hold that's very hard to break out of, a very particular group. I think that probably the best modern example for this audience of what you're talking about is climate change.
Yes.
I talk about this a lot.
Perfect example.
People who don't believe in climate change are often simply victims, or they are beholden to very specific rhetoric that is agenda-driven. There is no logical, reasonable, scientific, thoughtful
Even Exxon
purpose.
agrees it's happening.
Exactly.
And did 20, 30 years ago.
So if you don't believe in climate change, it's very likely that you are listening to the rhetoric of a certain political party or a certain group of individuals who have assets that they want to protect and who have built up and it sounds like I'm a conspiracy theorist, but I'm not, because I'm a skeptic. That's not what I do.
I Googled you, man, before I came here. You think I would just show up somewhere?
But yeah, it's true. And I think it's so important that we remember that, that oftentimes those shifts in the powers there are some deep emotional, ethical reasons that decisions are made, and then oftentimes there are financial reasons that decisions are made. And just like you were saying, just protecting an investment. Yeah. You've been so focused on this one goal your entire career, your entire industry.
They've got this amortization sheet, and they've got to get to the end of it. There's other people that I know who are very well off, who are extremely enlightened.
Yeah.
And so it's not just being wealthy and
having money doesn't make you greedy.
Some people just really don't want to know. Or they're just gonna finish their thing and then they're out and they're totally for it later once I disengage myself from this investment.
And it's a hard thing. It's a hard decision to make, to say I would rather pick the high road even though that's going to ding me financially. Yeah. Like, it's not easy for people to do that. And we've all done it. We've all had a price on certain things, and we've taken jobs, or we've decided to go a certain route because it was more lucrative when you sort of were convincing yourself that it was okay to do that.
Rationalization.
It's so good.
I would also say that a lot of the real, and I'll put quotes around this, high performers in finance really stretch themselves, which is to say that their margin of error is not great. They're keeping all the balls in the air just barely, and if they pull it off, they're going to be set. But if there's one hiccup, the whole thing comes tumbling down, and I think that's part of the adherence to these types of things. It's like just a little while longer.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. All right, so let's end things on a positive note then. When you think about the future, what are you really hopeful and optimistic for?
What I am hopeful about is, and it's going to sound like I'm tying it back to my book, but part of what fascinated me with Change Agent was this fourth industrial revolution. We have had centuries now of manufacturing processes and agriculture, well, a century of industrial agriculture that has really done tremendous damage to the environment in which we live.
Absolutely. Undeniably.
And what I'd like people to think about is instead of anti-GMO and having this monolithic, very secretive structure, perhaps, that they see that genetic modification can be insidious, is to think of it, again, like the internet. The internet opening up this idea of experimenting and understanding and gaining mastery of DNA to start to become more at one with the world. It's not a matter of completely ravaging and changing nature. It's changing our systems so that they can more cooperatively work with nature. And I'll give you one example. Actually, I'll give you several.
Sure.
Actually, you'll have to make me stop giving examples. But the first one that fascinates me is the idea of, let's say, instead of manufacturing car fenders, the idea of having synthetic organisms like bacteria, yeast growing chitin, which is the same shell-like material that shrimp or lobster make, being able to grow fenders and things like that as part of cars that would then be biodegradable and could go right back into the biology, into the ecosystem without poisoning the world. Building that sort of cradle-to-cradle manufacturing using synthetic biology,
Which
designing
we
organisms.
have to do with plastic. We
Algae,
have to.
yes, absolutely. Designing algae perhaps to sequester carbon from water, or designing two different E. coli, let's say one to produce a sugar that the other one can consume to then produce a biofuel, clean-burning biofuel, and on and on and on. All of these interesting things. And again, cellular agriculture that would use just 1 or 2% of the land area. A lot of people aren't aware that 90% of agricultural land is used in meat production. And when I learned that, it blew my mind, because if you think about it, all of this land is being used to develop feed to then feed to animals.
That's true.
Or that the animals are on.
They're all eating corn.
And they're all eating corn. And then there's the damage to the watershed from these manure lagoons and all this. This industrial agriculture really does a great deal of damage. If we can change it around so that there's a lot less cruelty or no cruelty, and then animals, yes, a lot less cows might exist. That doesn't mean we're going to go on a massive pogrom. It's just we change the way things are. We phase them out so that there's not a lot of this, again, industrial production and cruelty against animals. And instead work on cellular agriculture. I'm hopeful about all of these modern, these new practices using genetic editing and synthetic biology to create a much more sustainable future. Now think about it. If all that land could be put to other uses, whether it's providing more place for humans to live or returning that land, some of it at least, to its natural state, that could accelerate our effort to try to hold the line on climate change or slow it down. All of these things, I'm really excited about that. I look at that and I think that's bigger than the internet. And it's so much more into the real world. It's literally changing the real world. I mean, how cool is that? So I'm super, super excited about the future when I think of those things.
Me too. And I can't wait to eat a zebra burger.
What do you have?
Cruelty-free zebra burger.
Yeah, you really want to eat a zebra burger. And the funny part is it's probably going to taste terrible.
It's going to taste terrible, I know, but I have to at least try.
Well, you'll have the opportunity.
Well, Dan, thank you so much. Hey, let everybody know where they can reach out on Twitter, Facebook. What are you most active on, or are you not really a social media guy?
I'm a social media guy unless I'm heads down writing, which is certain portion of the year where I'll go at what I call periscope depth. But yeah, I'm reachable on Twitter. It's @it's Daniel Suarez.
Nice.
And then daniel-suarez.com is my website. I'm also on Google+. Some people are surprised about that. I love Google+. I've been on there since forever, which is really the reason why I like it. I've built a community there. I'm on Facebook as well. And let me see, Change Agent is coming out April 18th. That's also available everywhere. And, man, this was so fun.
So much fun. Thank you so much for joining me.
It was my pleasure.
And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.